Have a look at this. This is Ed Davey in a canoe. And for some reason, one of the guys who's with him, I think that's one of his chief of staff or somebody, tips them up out of the canoe. They then proceed to behave like sort of toddlers, throwing water over each other, wearing life jackets in what looks like about a foot of water. And you're kind of going, that's the only thing I now know has happened at the Lib Dem conference, because I don't care about anything they're actually talking about. But they do look a bit daft, don't they? Leon?
Yeah, they look really daft. I mean, I don't know what the thought process there is that they're trying to achieve with that. I mean, it's not a good look. I remember when was it Neil Kinnock back in the day at the Labour conference when he fell into the river into the sea.
Yeah.
And you just sort of think the metaphors that you can get from that are not good. I don't know what the thinking process is behind it, but I mean, conference season is one of those where if you're an opposition party like the Lib Dems, you're trying to make a bit of a name for yourself. Yeah. But is this the right name for yourself? Are people looking at that thinking that's the man that I want to vote for? That's the man that I want to give power to?
In some ways, it might. I mean, I'm not expecting the Lib Dems to do particularly well at the next election. I could be wrong about that, but you know, in some cases, you might say this is the last conference before the election. And if there were an opportunity for the Lib Dems to, go into some kind of coalition, loose or otherwise, with Labour, if that was the case, or with the Tories, you want to know that they represent a little bit more than standing in sort of ankle-deep water, wearing life jackets and throwing water over each other.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. I mean, if you ask someone on the street, what's your takeaway from Lib Dem conference, and they would say Ed Davey looking like a prat on the beach, and I don't think that's a vote winner. So, what policies have they announced? What's their plan and their big vision for the country? No one knows. They just see them frolicking around. So, yeah, it's a bit of a strange one. I'm sure we probably won't see that from more seasoned politicians at the Labour and the Conservative conference. I doubt that we'll see Rishi.
This is a big important conference for Labour, isn't it? I mean, they've really got to make their mark, and Starmer has got to look like a Prime Minister when he makes his speech. They're going to have to do something to him. They're going to have to give him some pizzazz or something like that.
Yeah, they are. And this is the sort of try before you buy moment, really, for voters to see him in that role. Is he a guy that you could trust with the keys to number 10? And I think that Labour are going into this conference season feeling a lot more optimistic than they have done in previous years. I mean, I remember the Corbyn years, conference had the sort of feeling of a funeral because it was just horrific and they knew they were in for a drubbing, whereas, it looks as though Labour are on course for a pretty good set of election results. Yeah. So I think Starmer has to not put his foot in it. Basically, that's going to be his key objective, is to not make a fool of himself and hope that carries him through and they can retain their lead in the polls.
I think the other danger for Starmer as well is the sort of the rogue element of the Labour Party, the people who are in and around, not necessarily the Houses of Parliament, but councillors, some activists. There's a lot of what I would regard as, if I was Keir Starmer, quite dangerous people out there with some quite dangerous opinions.
Yeah, I mean, his job coming in after Corbyn was to try and effectively expel all of those that hold loony left views, and he's done quite a good job of removing that from the sort of central inner sanctum of the party. But actually, as you say, those members still exist, Mike, and those councillors are still there. So if we start hearing vox pops of people at Labour conference and they're coming out with crazy suggestions that perhaps are more like Jeremy Corbyn than they are Keir Starmer, then it might make voters think, okay, well, those guys are still in and around the party. Have they really changed? Are Labour really a party that can be trusted?
Absolutely right. Let's just talk about HS2 for a moment, because the story in the Times today has got the Prime Minister basically pulling the plug on the bit from Birmingham to Manchester based upon the runaway cost of the project. I mean, it's a bit like a bloke waking up in the morning and going, I didn't realise it was going to be light. I mean, HS2 has been over budget ever since the day they mentioned HS2. But I'm also told that it's not possible for the HS2 project to spend any money unless it's signed off by ministers in the first place. So is he being a bit, shall we say, economical with the truth here?
Possibly. And, HS2 is one of those projects that, as you say, has just been controversial since the day it started. And actually, when you look at it, the technology that we're now using on HS2 is so outdated that it's almost not worth doing. So I do think there is a bit of an issue with HS2 more broadly, albeit I do think that the investment is probably quite good for the economy, but perhaps it's too good. And that's what Rishi Sunak's getting at, is that these contractors are just paying themselves huge salaries because they've got this HS2 bounce in their bottom line. and all the other sort of expenses that go alongside a huge infrastructure project like that. And I think Sunak's thinking, look, at a time when the economy isn't necessarily firing on all cylinders, do we need to draw things in a bit? Do we need to be a bit more frugal with the money that we spend? And I think that's what's going to be driving his motivation to potentially scrap it. Obviously, a lot of folks in the north, where the leg is going to be scrapped, are up in arms.
Yeah.
Andy Burnham is furious about it, and I get that. That they obviously want to have their region connected to the rest of the country, but I guess Sunak's job is to look at it as a bigger picture. What is it like for the country as a whole, not just any particular region that benefits directly from HS2?
But I mean, the other problem, I suppose, for anyone wanting to scrap something which is quite well advanced, is that they've bought, have they not, loads of tracts of land. They've compulsorily purchased people's houses. I know certainly between London and Birmingham, there's massive amounts of construction that have been done. I don't know how much has been done beyond Birmingham, but, they've been working on this for a long time. And so there's quite a lot of stuff to suddenly just abandon if they're going to just go, right, well, that's it stops here. That's the end.
Yeah, and you have to look at that. You have to say, is it worth it? If we make these X number of billion savings by scrapping it entirely, well, how much have we spent getting to this point? And it's on things like consultants, like planners, these things that all goes on behind the scenes before a shovel's even hit the ground, that costs a hell of a lot of money still. So that money is just going to go down the drain if it is scrapped, and we have to just write it off, which I think would be a bit of a shame. But these big infrastructure projects are not bad for the country because they do create jobs and they do create growth when these huge big projects like HS2 would be. But it's whether or not Rishi Sunak thinks he's getting value for money. And I think this goes to the heart of one of the biggest problems in government, is that they take a blank checkbook approach where they say, right, we're building this thing, just get it done, because the ministers don't want the bad headlines. So they just say, yeah, spend, when I think we should be a lot more prudent. We should be able to actually say, is this value for money? And if it isn't, then you have to look elsewhere and maybe look at another contractor to carry out the job. There's enough of them out there.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, for Rishi Sunak, actually, he hasn't had a terrible week because, according to one of the polls that's been done recently, he's had a bit of an 8-point surge because he's delayed the ban on petrol cars from 2030 to 2035. I think that's a much more popular policy than the Net Zero Brigade would like to think.
I think so. I mean, a lot of people, when they heard that news, were thinking, I can't afford an electric car, in what is effectively around the corner. And they're not cheap, these electric cars. Now, obviously, the hope is that by 2030, they would have been cost would have come down a bit, but there's no guarantee of that. So people are already feeling as if they've got that weight off of their mind, feeling as though, okay, I don't have to fork out on an electric car in 2030 if I need to buy a new one then. So I think people are probably looking at this and feeling quite reassured by that. And yes, if there is a big bump in the polls for Sunak, he might be thinking, well, what else can I do in the net zero space to make things a bit easier for people? Because clearly that could be a wedge issue between him as the Conservatives and Labour Party. Yeah, well, if he manages to give some people some tax back, he could be onto a winner, because I'm still not convinced by Keir Starmer, and I think a lot of people are not convinced by Keir Starmer, that he's definitely going to be the answer and that he would suddenly improve the lot of this country. No, I don't. And I think Keir Starmer is one of those politicians who is ahead in the polls, quite frankly, because the Tories have made a mess of it over the past couple of years. It's not because they love the Labour Party or they love Keir Starmer. He's just been a beneficiary of the Tories' misfortune. So I think when it actually comes to a head-to-head, when they're both up on the podium on a debate, or when it's a clear shootout between which of these two men do you want to become Prime Minister, I think actually Sunak becomes more appealing, and he is more popular. The Rishi Sunak brand is more popular than the Conservative Party brand. So, there is still hope, I think. And I don't think it's going to be a whitewash in the elections that people are saying it's going to be. I think it's going to be a lot tighter than the polls currently suggest. And I think that will probably be down to Keir Starmer just being a bit of a cardboard politician. What is there to the guy? Yeah, absolutely right. Leon, good to see you. Thanks for talking to us.